that kind of worked.
This is for free. All right. Well, thanks for coming to the IOE Rough Cut series. We have a full docket. We'll be getting out the full set here soon. I think we're just about to this. We got a couple pull-outs. So we're trying to make up for this. But anyway, today we have with us Kyran Kunkel from the American Prairie Reserve and the biologist there. Kyran is Director of Wildlife Restoration and Science at the APR and has done considerable work there. And they're restoring the plains in many respects. So I won't go into a lot of detail about that because he's going to tell us about that. But before this APR experience, he worked as a contractor to initiate the bison restoration program, and through collaborative effort with World Wildlife Fund, where he served as senior fellow. He has led a wide range of efforts, including cougar conservation, swift fox reintroduction, wolf research, and tracking pronghorn migration routes. He studied moose, wolverine, and grizzly and black bears as the regional wildlife biologist for the Alaskan region of the National Park Service, and also served as senior biologist for the Turner Endangered Species Fund. So a long history in conservation biology.
Oh, with charismatic megafauna.
Oh, charismatic. Yeah.
Even prairie dogs. We count prairie dogs as charismatic.
Okay. Oh, they are. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, they might not make others.
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, so he's also on the faculty as a affiliate professor of wildlife biology at the University of Montana. So join me in welcoming Kyran.
Thank you, Bruce. Good morning or afternoon. Thank you all for coming. This can be, since it's a nice cozy group, pretty informal as we want it to be. Feel free to interrupt with questions, but I mostly want to just give you an introduction to us and to the project, and to put out a pitch for help, and hopefully have some notes of inspiration for conservation, big scale conservation for everyone. How many in here have ever heard of American Prairie Reserve? Wow, that's great. When I go to Town and Country, it's none. So this is so this is good. And when I go to Malta, it's everyone. So this is a good start. So let's dive right into it. So we're going to talk about the restoration work we're doing, the conservation work on the American Prairie Reserve. I'll give you a bit of history, our goals, and projects that we've got going on, science and otherwise. And like I said, feel free to ask questions, but we should have plenty of time. We have the hour. Okay. So many of you are probably familiar with the Great Plains, the Northern Great Plains, and know that it was what we might have historically called America's Serengeti, if we had known about the Serengeti back then. It was the place of big animal abundance, even more so higher densities than the Mountain West, where we typically think of wildlife diversity and abundance. When Lewis and Clark came through the area in the early 1800s, 1804, they traveled up the Missouri River and moved west to the Pacific coast. Once they got to past the present-day Montana border and entered the eastern part of present-day Montana, this is where they saw the greatest abundance and diversity of wildlife on their whole trip. This was the area of abundance. They'd go up on the every day as they're going up the river. Lewis and Clark would travel up on the benches above the river bottom and just retold stories in the journals about the great abundance of bison, elk, pronghorn, prairie dogs, swift foxes. It was a mecca for wildlife abundance and diversity. But that's changed over the past 200 years. The Great Plains of North America has changed pretty dramatically. More species have been extirpated in that grassland than any other North American biome. Almost 3/4 of the obligate species there are imperiled. Carnivores and ungulates, grasslands have lost more on average than any other biome. And this all fits the big picture of losses for wildlife. World Wildlife Fund did a study in the last few years, and they found that global wildlife populations throughout the world since the 1970s had declined by half. So this fits the trend globally, but it's very acute in the Great Plains because the Great Plains, of course, is our food belt. Part of the reason why we've not secured the great diversity and wildlife biodiversity on the Great Plains is because we've protected them very poorly. They are the least protected biome in North America and globally. On the bottom, temperate grasslands, less than 2% have been received any kind of conservation protection. And globally, grasslands, steppe, places that still have large areas that are potential to still to secure are only 4 places: the Kazakh steppe, the Mongolian steppe, Patagonia, and the northern Great Plains in North America. So we've also recently not done a great job of protecting much of anything in the United States. Since the last time we protected a large park, a large national park, was in the 1970s. And since that time, we've done less and less protection, at least of parks. So this is a map of parks in the national parks in the U.S. That number has declined. The number of new creations has declined. And for reasons why you might all guess that it's a hard thing to do for a government top-down approach to securing big protected areas. We've done pretty poor globally, as a matter of fact. The United States scores 19th globally out of 20 countries in this assessment of securing megafauna. Again, talking about large mammals. We're behind Estonia. That I don't think that's anything to be proud of, especially as some people are talking about making America great again. We're not doing a very good job of it. The other new science that's coming out also indicates that in addition to needing to secure large areas, the best science is starting to indicate we need to secure really large areas. E.O. Wilson and others have indicated that nature needs half. We need to set aside nature in some ways across the globe over the long term. To secure 70 to 80% of biodiversity requires half of nature. Fortunately, the good news in our part of the world is that the Northern Great Plains here, nature can potentially recover. We haven't saved half, but we've got the building blocks for securing that. So American Prairie Reserve has gone out now to around the world looking at some of these models for conservation because it's not working in North America or in a lot of places around the world, finding what's working. We've looked at top-down approaches in Bhutan, Brazil, and Kazakhstan. We've looked at private philanthropy, Patagonica, Gorangosa, Blackfoot Challenge here in Montana, Turner here in Montana. We've looked at conservancies in Namibia and Central Asia, and then community incentive programs, because we like to think of ourselves as, there's a book that all APR collaborators and employees read. It's called Steal Like an Artist. So we like to steal ideas and make them work in North America. We like to think of ourselves as learning from others and being very entrepreneurial, finding the best place and people to make this conservation idea work. So our mission is to create the largest nature reserve in the continental United States, a spectacular refuge for people and wildlife preserved forever as part of America's heritage. This is not a new idea. This is going on as the big decline in abundance on the Great Plains was going on. George Catlin came out to the Great Plains in the mid-1800s and talked about creating a nation's park. Even before Yellowstone was created, Catlin had this idea in the Great Plains of creating a nation's park. So we did, based on this information, the abundance of species, the losses that had occurred, we and other collaborators in the U.S., in the Western U.S., looked at what are the best opportunities remaining in the Northern Great Plains to secure conservation, and found 10 of those best places in the Northern Great Plains, and the best of those 10 was in north central Montana. This area that, the general area in the circle there, for reasons that you might expect, large public lands. If you look at that yellow and that green, that's all public lands. That habitat is still relatively intact, has not been tilled. The potential for threats are low. Oil and gas development potential threats are really low. So this turned out to be the best place in the Great Plains for big scale conservation. So our model is this. We first create the habitat. Our model is of willing buyer, willing seller, buying ranches in that area and building on the public lands that already exist in the area, then restoring the biodiversity, and then also making it accessible and enjoyable by humans. So our vision is creating the largest wildlife population on the continent and trying to get back to ecological capacity and raising benchmarks rather than being part of the declining benchmarks that we're seeing globally. And why so big? So we've done a bit of on-the-ground science, and the more on-the-ground science that you do, the bigger the results are, the bigger the area you need to secure. This is a quick cartoon of work we did on pronghorn antelope. We found the longest distance migration of a land mammal in the lower 48 with these pronghorn antelope that summered up in Alberta even and into Saskatchewan, and then wintered south of the Missouri River. One-way migrations of over 250 miles. So if you were to put a circle around that population of pronghorn, it would be over 8 million acres to secure that population of pronghorn. We also did work on mountain lions, cougars, starting on the Rocky Boys in the Bear Paws, and moving over to the Little Rockies and the Belknap Reservation, then finally over onto the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge. And again, if we were to look at this species and the connectivity or the area needed to secure a viable population of cougars in the area, it was about 7,000 square miles, or square kilometers, sorry. So all these things lead to bigness and fit what our mission is here, and the idea of inspiring others by doing big things. Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans. Aim high and hope and work, remembering that a noble logical diagram, once we're recorded, will never die, but long after we are gone, will be a living thing, asserting itself with ever-growing insistency. So we are working to secure conservation in a large area. To date, these are the areas in blue are the ranches that we have purchased starting in the early 2000s. The most recent one here is called the Two Crows, south of the Missouri River. So the model is that those light blue areas are the allotments, in most cases Bureau of Land Management allotments, that go with the dark blue areas, which are the deeded lands. So we buy the deeded lands and then get control of the allotments that go with those deeded lands. So when we combine those private lands with the allotments and with the core area, which is the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge, the Upper Missouri Breaks, and the other public lands in the area, then we believe we can get to our goal, which is about 3.5 million acres. A park, a reserve, again, half the size of Yellowstone National Park. So just to give you some perspective, this is one purchase of these ranches is similar to a national park, in this case, Wind Cave National Park. So these are big ranches in a big landscape we're working in. So to date, and this slide is a little bit already outdated, we have created the second largest reserve in the Great Plains of the U.S. following CMR, and coincidentally, that's great because CMR is part of our model. Go ahead.
I had a question about the leased lands, the allotments.
Yeah.
Are those tied to the deeded lands in perpetuity, or could BLM at some point in the future say, well, if you're not using those allotments, we can just turn them over to someone else?
Right. It depends on who you ask. BLM technically has to, some argue that they're a right, some argue they're a privilege. There's mixed law on it, but in the practical day-to-day is that BLM reviews those leases supposedly on an annual basis, and then every 10 years, every decade decides whether you're meeting their objectives for grazing on those allotments. And if you are, then you get another 10-year, your allotment is renewed for another 10 years. So BLM does do those reviews, and if you don't take use, meaning for at least over 3 years, if we bought something and did not graze it as part of the Tailored Grazing Act, then that lease can theoretically go to somebody else. That makes sense? So, in addition, the model is then trying to create this large landscape, create this habitat. The question then becomes, for restoring biodiversity, what are the primary limiting factors? What do we need to manage or deal with in this part of the world, and so that we can get restoration back? And as is true globally, a big limiting factor is livestock. So the reason why ungulates and prairie dogs and large predators are reduced in this area over time has been competition with livestock. So that number is, at least has grown significantly since the middle of last century, and it continues now pretty steadily in the West. But globally, that number is increasing and is projected to increase dramatically over time because of the increased prosperity and demand for meat. So globally, livestock production will not only stay the same as it has, projections are in the West, it's going to increase. That has led to, as mentioned, limiting range and limiting space and limiting abundance of other species. Bison, wild bison, they are a conservation-reliant species. In Montana, one could readily argue that they're ecologically extinct. Most of the places that we have bison anywhere in North America are small herds, and so don't probably perform the ecological impacts that they did historically on a large landscape. In Montana, the only place we have wild bison are when they come out occasionally on the north and west side of Yellowstone, and that's our only wild population. There is the bison range, which is a fenced population, technically classified as a public wild bison herd too. Otherwise, cattle have taken the place, over 2 million cattle, and almost no populations of wild or conservation populations of bison. The primary limiting factors are, as we discussed, space, because there's cattle on all that space, and then perceptions. I'm sure all of you are pretty familiar with the Greater Yellowstone and the issues of bison conservation in the Greater Yellowstone, and we have the same issues in northern Montana and the same issues throughout the West with bison, perceptions of disease problems, competition with livestock, damage, and so there's need to, and this is one of our goals of our project, to put bison on the landscape and demonstrate that these perceptions are not significant in terms of cost, and that is the only we think the way you change attitudes is actually having animals on the ground and people experiencing those animals. We've had bison now for over a decade. We used to have regular meetings with the neighbors because the neighbors were very concerned about what the bison would do, breaking fences, the disease concerns, and we don't have those meetings anymore because no one shows up. So it's been a lesson that is demonstrated only by having animals on the ground. So we try and, as mentioned before, we try to learn from others in everything we do. And of course, we can't do everything. So we have to make choices and we have to select priorities. And so we select priority species. And then we do science action. So we do reintroductions, work for policy change, social cultural change, and work on incentives to make some changes in the landscape. We choose, of course, keystone species, in the case here, prairie dogs, and the other species they influence, and they're critical for biodiversity on the Great Plains. We choose bison as a keystone or a foundation species because the way they grazed historically produced habitats that were important for a multitude of species, in this case, birds. If you look at the current management with cattle, we manage for the middle, take half, leave half generally. That's good for the species, these bird species anyway in the middle, but not so good for the species on the edges. So we've just started a collaboration with the Smithsonian Institute to look at how bison grazing on a large landscape versus cattle grazing versus no grazing works to influence biodiversity, especially bird diversity. How do we measure what we're doing and if we're achieving success and if we're moving in the right direction long-term and adaptively managed? We have a work that we call, for lack of a new name, we're always looking for new interesting names for things. It's named after the senior author. It's called the Prairie scale. So we look at and the Prairie scale essentially looks at drivers, what we think are drivers of biodiversity on the Great Plains, and how you would manage those drivers or how you would influence those drivers. And we found 10 key drivers on the Great Plains, and then we, going from 1 to 7 on our scale, look at going from intensive cattle management, intensive livestock management, to biodiversity management, and we score ourselves along the way on each of those things. We've got another Smithsonian project that's just started to refine this scale, to put some real hard numbers on it, and also to test it, to see if it actually is doing what we want it to do. We've one of the first tests of that has been with bison, where we look at all the factors in the Prairie scale and how they would influence restoring bison on the ground, what we need to restore, and then what the impacts of bison are on the ground. And then we measure if we're doing right, if we're making ecologically making a difference on the ground as we score ourselves through the Prairie scale. So to go into a little bit of information on the status of species and specific projects and ideas and needs we have related to species, again, livestock are a primary limiting factor. So the trend for for pronghorn in northern Montana has not been good over the last decade. It results from limiting by hunting, but primarily the last few winters, you look at 2010, 2011 was a severe winter. We just had another severe winter. This only goes through 2013, but that number has declined even more after the last severe winter of last year. If we look at elk, we think the elk objectives set by the state are way too low. They're set that way because the neighbors, the livestock producers, want them set low because they don't want elk competing with cattle. So the challenge for us is to find incentives to allow those neighbors to be more tolerant of more elk and to provide some mitigation tools. How do we reduce fence damage? How do we reduce those direct conflicts between elk and livestock? So all these areas in eastern Montana and a lot of Montana are red, are over objective, and the objective for the north side, our project area north of the river, is only 14 to 1,600 elk. We look at historic populations of elk in the area, looking at observations and carrying capacity, and we think that number should be more like 30, 40, 50,000. So we think we could have more realistically a population moving from 1,500 elk, probably in the overall greater project area around the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge is probably around 5,000 elk. We think we can get up to 25,000 elk, that the habitat will support that greater abundance. And in fact, we're starting to see this. Again, like bison, we think that elk are ecologically extinct on the prairie. So they exist in the breaks along the Missouri River, but a site like this is rare to see, that you would see any animals out in the open where this is something that, of course, historically Lewis and Clark would have seen, but it's rare to find this. We rarely see this, and we think the potential, though, is great. The grass is there, the carrying capacity is there. We looked at cougars, as I mentioned, in the cougar study, and what we found, every radio-collared cougar that we had in the project, over 20 radio-collared cougars in that study area, none of them survived more than 12 months. They all died within 12 months from hunting. So we think, based on that work, we're doing some follow-up now, that it's not a viable population, that because of hunting and harvest, the cougars are there, but we need to reduce and the perception is conflict with lions and livestock. So again, managing, understanding what those perceptions and conflicts are, and trying to figure out how to change or incentivize more cougars on the ground. One thing we can do is change hunting management. So we're a reserve. We're not managed as a national park. We see the value of hunting on the landscape in some of our units. Some work that's been done from South America showing that though when you reduce hunting pressure, then your predator and ungulate abundance goes up. Not rocket science, of course, but it's hard to convince our neighbors and the state that we should be restricting hunting at all. But that's one of our strategies, is to reduce the impacts of human hunting. There's been great work, of course, here out of MSU on bighorn sheep over the long term of the state. These are a couple of young rams out on the prairie, out in our project area. Day after this photo was taken, they were shot because they were in an area of no-go for bighorn sheep, because they are in an area of domestic sheep. So the worry is that these guys get out on the prairie, they move between populations, or they go back home to their source population, and they pass disease back to the population, and it crashes. We also are going to do work on the ground, direct. So some of the things we can't manage directly, and we'll talk about this in a bit. It would be very easy for me to get into a pickup truck and go to Glacier and Yellowstone and load up about 6 wolves and 6 bears and bring them out to the prairie. It wouldn't go over very well in the neighborhood or with the state, so we can't do that. So when we talk about the big predators, we're looking at social tolerance. How do we change social tolerance? some of the things we can. Some of the things we can work with the state and probably get permits. So there are no swiftbacks. This is an endemic species of the Great Plains, about the size of a house cat. There are no swiftbacks in the project area. There are some along the border because of reintroduction done in Canada back in the late 80s, early 1990s. We are proposing to the state of Montana that we go translocate some of those foxes to restore them to the American Prairie Reserve area. So there are things that we can do, assuming we think we've got good science for the permit to allow that to happen, and we'll find out from the state whether we can proceed a project like this. Prairie dogs, as mentioned, a big driver in the system. The habitat where we are is excellent for prairie dogs, big potential, but of course big conflicts with livestock, or at least perceptions. So we're again working with Smithsonian Institute to look at ways, map out the best connectivity and best potential for expanding these populations, and then getting them to a level where they bring back the other biodiversity, and understanding what that biodiversity is and how we bring that back, especially the keystone in that system. Sorry, not the keystone, but the top predator in that system, which is black-footed ferrets, which are the most endangered mammal in the U.S. and are less than currently west-wide, probably 300 ferrets in the wild. One of the things we can do on the ground is, as we buy, this is a combination of 3 ranches. And again, the yellow is Bureau of Land Management, the white, the no color is the deeded. When we buy them and we convert them to bison, take livestock off them, put up bison fencing on the perimeter, because as you probably all know, bison are classified as livestock in Montana. So that is a species we can do things with because they're classified as livestock. What we do then is go in and remove the interior fencing, because bison behave very differently, and we've done research on this, as have others, that they move on the landscape in a very different pattern than cattle, which have to be managed, which rely on being close to water, have to be managed by rest rotation. Bison don't require that, so we remove those interior fences. So far, we've removed about 70 miles of fencing. We've made 125 miles wildlife friendly, and we're in the process of removing another 250 miles and making beyond that another 250 miles wildlife friendly as we expand the area. So for bison, what do we think is ecological restoration? There was a paper done probably a decade ago now looking at the factors influencing bison: large herd size, natural population structure, limits by predators, issues with health and genetics. So we addressed all those issues. And our goal is to restore at least 10,000 bison to the American Prairie Reserve and to have them conserved in a way that's consistent with all those goals. Again, going to back to the idea of how bison behave and move differently on the landscape. This is the area. We had a graduate student from the University of Montana do this project, look at the area and movements of cattle versus bison. And the landscape scale that you need for bison management is orders of magnitude larger than you need for cattle, primarily because they don't go very far beyond water. We also did another follow-up study to that project with Clemson University, where we looked at bison role as a keystone species, because there was work in the tallgrass prairie seeing that they were, and he found that there was higher species richness when compared to no cattle areas or livestock areas, but there weren't differences yet in bare ground or heterogeneity. So perhaps there will be no differences, or perhaps we haven't studied we don't have bison on a large enough scale yet, or we haven't had them for a long enough period of time. So we need to continue that work. And as mentioned, our goal, we're nearing 1,000 now bison on the reserve, and our goal is to get to over 10,000 in another decade. Again, the limiting factor is tools, ideas, and ways to deal with the conflict with livestock, dealing with livestock-wildlife interactions. One of the ideas that we, again, stole from somewhere else, some of us went over to a program in Africa and Namibia called cheetah-friendly beef that a woman named Lori Marker started, and she was paying the ranchers in the area not to kill cheetahs. So we took that idea. Unfortunately, there was no market. She couldn't find a good market for selling that kind of beef. So we took that idea, brought it back here, and bought a beef company and created a beef company called Wild Sky Beef. So that if you follow the Prairie scale and do wildlife-friendly practices, we will incentivize that. We will pay you 1 cent, 2 cent, 3 cent per pound in the fall of those animals that you sell for doing wildlife-friendly practices. The design for this concept is such that we would work, again, as big as the reserve hopes to be, 3.5 million acres. As you know from other protected areas like Glacier or from Yellowstone National Park, once you get outside of that, even a big protected area, you have conflicts on private lands and with the neighbors. So our idea with this wild sky beef incentive is to work with the neighbors, and in some cases they'll be directly in the reserve, and do wild sky beef contracts with them so that we soften the boundaries in the buffer zone. As based on conservation design, you need a large reserve area, and then you also need a buffer area to ensure the long-term persistence of the biodiversity within the reserve. So we're selling the packaging. Actually, I need to update the slide. Has changed. It's much more fun, and we got pictures of our ranchers on the back of the packages, and we got pictures of wildlife on the front of our packages. You'll all head to Town and Country this afternoon on your way home and buy a few packages. If you don't have time for that, Amazon.com. So the idea with wildlife-friendly beef is it fits the Prairie scale. So we use the Prairie scale drivers to incentivize ranchers to do wildlife-friendly practices, because either they have conflicts directly with in terms of infrastructure on the ground, or they have conflicts with competition with livestock. So one of the things we do, what our big push is to be predator friendly. So one of the line items in there is restoration of large carnivores. And so we have a program within Wild Sky Beef called Cameras for Conservation, where we put up camera traps on each ranch, and then we monitor the species at those camera traps to, number one, ensure that if they agree to do predator friendly, that we measure the baseline of predators, and then we make sure that staying at that baseline or increasing. But additionally, on top of that, we have a bonus program. So a picture of a cougar, if you get a picture of a cougar on your ranch, we pay you directly $300. So this is incentivizing these guys to be alive rather than dead. So we're giving direct bonuses for the presence of black bears, grizzly bears, cougars, and other species of concern that we're interested in if they sign up for predator friendly on the ranch. We also do then, this is some work that was done in Alberta, can do things on the ground with collaborators to try and mitigate. Range riders, guard dogs, change the fencing and so forth, so that not only are you providing the incentive, you're preventing the conflict in the first place. So when you combine with what we've done in terms of securing leased and deeded lands with the Wild Sky program, we're almost to 500,000 acres of conservation in the project area. And we hope to grow that significantly. We have about 8 Wild Sky ranchers now. We want to keep adding a few each year. And this is not a new, like I said, we stole this from Namibia. And this is not a new idea even in North America. There was a wolf-friendly beef program that Defenders did down in the Southwest. It didn't work. There was a conservation beef program in Madison Valley that TNC's did, and it didn't last. And we're in early years. Early years, we were selling up to 50,000 pounds of beef a month, but there's no guarantee that that continues. The challenge is to create something that's really great tasting that people are going to like and buy. And number two, that it's wildlife friendly, so they're going to pay more for that, so we can transfer that money back to the ranchers. But we got to create the demand first. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves establishing too many ranchers and not have the demand for the beef. So the trick is to create that big demand. So put it on Amazon, put it in high-end restaurants and stores on the coast where people have are more potentially more income and interest in that idea. And so we're starting to grow that way. It's a hard job. Selling beef is a hard thing. And the margins are very slim, just as the margins of ranching are very slim. But we've got a great business plan and great business people. Part of the problem, again, in the past, is I like to describe to when we go talk to ranchers about this idea, it's somebody like me, a biologist, sitting down with a rancher and saying, we ought to start a beef company. That doesn't get very far. So we've got people that know how to run a business and create this demand and great tasting products. So hopefully that will help keep this moving along. So as I mentioned, one of the things we can't do is bring large, and one of the things on the Prairie scale is restoration of that process of predation, large carnivores back on the landscape. The only large carnivore that we have in the project area now, as you saw, is cougars. They naturally recolonized this area from from the Greater Glacier, Northern Continental Divide system, or the Greater Yellowstone back in the 70s and 80s, moved to this area. We think the same thing is possible with grizzly bears and wolves. So these are just some wolf sightings and grizzly bear sightings over the recent time. It's amazing the number of, surprisingly, the number of grizzly bears now that are out on the front and moving east. We had a pair of subadult grizzly bears come within 40 miles of the reserve last year. So they're getting there. Wolves are great dispersers. They're getting there also. So the trick is, we think, one of the tricks is, to create this connectivity is find what are the key stepping stones in each of these places and focus on those with collaborators. So whether it be Wildlife Services or NRDC or Defenders of Wildlife, all of them are doing interesting things in terms of big predator conservation. And in addition to doing our wild sky beef program, because we won't likely in the short term be able to produce dozens and dozens of wild sky beef ranchers in the area, we will try and we'll do that, but we'll also work with collaborators to reduce conflicts. And so that's the idea of modeling and creating connectivity between the reserve and those other large reserves. And it fits with what we know of conservation design. You need to create a big reserve, you need to have a buffer around that reserve, and then you need to make sure it's not an island. You need to connect it to other places. So that's our idea in terms of reserve. It fits conservation design. The Montana Conservation Triangle, that is what this idea was originally developed by one of our board members, just in terms of tourism. When people come to Montana, of course, they go to Yellowstone, and then they go to Glacier, and that's their visit. We wanted to move the reserve as part of ecotourism into that mixture, and so that's the triangle. That's the triangle, and then that also then fits how we would connect those areas ecologically. As I mentioned, it's a window of surprising opportunity now, and it fits regional, even including fish, wildlife, and parks, conservation plans. Conflict, as I mentioned, is not just a Montana problem, it's a global problem, human-wildlife conflict. So we need innovations like wild sky beef, and we need tools to work in Montana and the rest of the world. And we need to look for other partners and other ideas to restore imperiled species. And these areas in that triangle in central Montana are in fact priority areas for Montana. So as an example of that, what we call the PN Ranch, one of our newest ranches here, this is Judith River, this is Arrow Creek. We have wild sky ranchers now in this circle. This circle is about the home range size of a wolf or a grizzly bear. And so you can imagine this being a stepping stone, in that case, connecting to the high woods and connecting to the little belts and to the big belts and to the Rocky Mountains. So that is the process that we're looking at, trying to prioritize where we place these activities and where we place these wild sky ranches. And in fact, now we have a wild sky ranch in the Shields Valley that has wolves on it. So another stepping stone where we picked up camera trap photos of wolves on that ranch and paid, I think for wolves, we pay $400 for a photo of wolves. So that rancher has benefited by wolves being on the family's ranch, and they don't allow, for the most part, to date, this has been 2 years now, control activities to occur on their ranch. So we think moving forward, we've proved the basic concept. One of our long-term partners has been National Geographic, described us early on as the most ambitious conservation project in American history. And more recently, Dr. Lovejoy, who's on our board, came out to visit and said it's moving ahead in a good fashion. The value of that moving ahead is now we're able to, so our big task early on was to raise a bunch of money. That's a big job. And so we've raised over $150 million. We've got a long ways to go to bring this down, and we'll talk about that at the end. But it's now that we've created a place and that we've got more staff and more funding, we can actually bring part 2 and part 3, which are wildlife restoration and public access, to play. So we've recently attracted Smithsonian Institution. They have a new program called the American Species Conservation Program, and I mentioned those 2 projects. They've got 2 postdoc students now working on the reserve, and we hope that'll be a decades-long project. We've been with National Geographic for a long time. They just recently soon will unveil this, that we are one of their last 5 wild places globally, This is Gorongosa, Patagonica, Pristine Seas program, an African Parks program. We fit in that big five where they're going to focus attention on telling the story of conservation here and helping us moving it ahead. One of the ways they're doing this is they're calling us a conservation technology garden. Geographic is really good at conservation technology and storytelling, so they're going to focus a bunch of attention and funding and tools to us to build conservation technology. We're then, as mentioned, trying to find ways to work with the greater partners of universities, of NGOs, and the neighbors to try and find ways that humans and wildlife can better thrive together in the long term. So our needs ahead, and this is where you all come in, is we've got a great place now. We've got a science and education center where you can, when you come up, you can stay there. We've got partners now on the ground, and we've got some work going on the ground that we can begin. We are now trying to reach out, doing things like this, spending more time reaching out. People are finding us, and we're going out finding other partners to do more of the work that we need to get done on the ground, because there's only so many of, there's three of us that are biologists in the program. The other 30 some odd are support and raising a lot of money. So we need, in order to do conservation, we need help. We need a bunch of partners. So we've got lots of great ideas. We want to learn great ideas from other people. That's why we travel around the world and visit other projects and hear other stories so that we can learn success stories. But we've got a bunch of things that we need help on and things we don't know about too that need help on. That, for example, Smithsonian and National Geographic have informed us, universities that we've worked with. So the more minds we wrap around this problem, the better and the faster and more efficient we're going to be in achieving success. This picture is something that we would consider to be success. The cost is pretty small. Well, this stadium here I don't think was $1 billion. Maybe it's approaching that now. But the average new football stadium, 15 acres, is about $1 billion. It lasts about, depending on where it is, which city, 10 or 20 years. Our project, over 3.5 million acres, lasting forever, is half that cost. So a bargain. We've already on our way to investing, and so part of our goal is to have an economic return. That's the way we're going to help change hearts and minds, is investing in the landscape, investing in the communities. And we've since 2013 have invested over $25 million in the area, not even counting land purchases. This is as we go to that picture of that Charlie Russell painting, this is a start of getting to that end. And this would be finally what I'd say. In addition to creating this place, this big reserve, this is a great opportunity, we think, for also people to want to get involved in doing conservation and research activities in this big place. Because if you and I had been around in 1872, of course, we would, I think, we would have probably jumped at that opportunity to be a part of Yellowstone. So with that, got some time for questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you, and thank you for your work. I have a couple of related questions that have to do with historical context and projections in the future. And one is that in the larger area, there's a lot of trees, and in the Missouri mussel shell breaks, and it's thought that there are far more trees than there were historically. We have ongoing research with the BLM where we're examining the effects of their prescribed fires. And so I'm wondering about your sense about the role of fire in managing the prairie out there and the role of trees. And related to that, is that area in particular in Montana is greening, becoming more productive. And this isn't published yet, but in fact, Earth system models that exist right now project that area to be a forest in 2100.
A forest, nice. We'll have lots of burning to do.
Exactly. So that's what all the climate models suggest, and those do not have sophisticated fire or land use in them. But just based upon climate and CO2, it's predicted to be a cool conifer forest. So
we have. So you'll be interested. So on our website, we did a climate report actually Dr. Frazee, who did the Frazee scale for us, looking at mostly at the conservation economy of that, of doing easements for carbon. But also it tells some predictions and uses data and so forth. So you'll be very interested in that. We'll be very interested to see your work. Pass that along whenever it's ready. As you would expect, one of the 10 drivers of the Frazee scale is fire. So CMR has done a good job of looking at fire history. Some of our partners, Sam Fuhlendorf is part of the Frazee scale. He's a big fire guy from southern Great Plains. So it's a big part of what we want to do. The challenge is politically. It's to start a fire in the neighborhood is a tough thing. So we have done a couple prescribed fires now with CMR. They have sent their crew out to the Prairie to the reserve and done prescribed fires for us. We want to do more of those, but the prescription has to be just right. Now with sage grouse and sagebrush, it's a bigger issue too, meaning there's more concern by the state about fire. So like all these, they're very hard problems to tackle. And I agree that we were just out on Burnt Lodge yesterday on the reserve, which was burned probably 5 or 6 years ago. And CMR burns pretty regularly, but oftentimes that fire was put out before it got out onto the prairie. So if you've got good ways to sell the neighborhood on fire, we would like to hear them. So potentially incentives, potentially partnerships and so forth. But yeah, and I agree, there are places you include the Mussel Shell, and then if you get out on the Upper Missouri Breaks Monument and so forth, coming in junipers and even ponderosa pines where they probably weren't.
So I guess this sort of brings up a deep philosophical issue with conservation in general, is that if it is true that the system is moving because of global changes towards something else, a new steady state perhaps, to what degree you stop that by burning and other management practices to keep it what you think it should be versus where it's going.
Yeah, and that's the big question, restore to what, right? Yeah. So where do we go back to woolly mammoths, or do we stick with bison? To our mind, bison are probably fine. It's hard enough work on bison. Woolly mammoths seem a bigger task. So yeah, that is a question. And I think fitting with in the Frazee scale, the work there is that keeping the processes and the potential there for adaptation to and resiliency to whatever as it comes forward. We have I don't think we necessarily have any preconceived notion of what it is 100 years from now, other than it's got potential to be biodiverse, rich, and less human directed in terms of our direct needs rather than biodiversity needs. So, but yeah, hard, interesting questions. Be fun to discuss. Yeah.
Another question has to do with forbs, and you have images of one pollinator, a honeybee, I think, in one of your images.
Oh, good.
I'm particularly interested in how pollinators respond to grassland management, fire, grazing, etc. So what percentage of this land has not ever been tilled or had seed planted into it? When you think about people producing cattle, they're going for the forage and they're going for the grass. So what percentage of your landscape would you say has not been modified and is native forbs, with forbs maybe being more dominant than the grasses?
So and that's why the area was chosen. This was like I said, one of the top 10 of the top 10, top 1 of top 10, because of almost no tillage. So there has been some, but and I think we have in our climate paper, I think it is 90% intact. So as you go farther, and I'll have a map up, but as you go farther north to the Milk River toward Malta, then that's river bottom, that's more productive, less rocky and hilly, and that's more tilled. And the same if you're going south. But the core we are is really intact, and low degree of invasives too. So they've done the ranching community has done a good job of keeping out invasives. That being said, this was a huge year which we'd never seen before for Japanese brome. everywhere you look, which we'd not seen before. But that being said, the typical ones we think of in the West are not very, very abundant. So we'd love to, we've done a couple bioblitzes just looking at the diversity of things out there. We'd love to have a better idea of what we've got for pollinators and how that's influenced in the neighborhood and by our management and the neighbors' management. It'd be fun.
There's no seeding sometimes people don't plow, but they just seed in.
Yeah, very, very little. I mean, there are again a few places where they put alfalfa in or tame grass in, timothy typically, but still, relatively speaking, pretty small. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really fun to see. I looked from your discussion that you've done a lot of, or that APR has done a lot of work thinking about other systems and other places and what works and what hasn't. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about the decision making that went around a parks model versus probably any other type of platform that you listed up there, especially if you look at or you mentioned the Blackfoot Challenge as a sort of local system that was working and they had a lot of successes that you were pulling from, but they're not really a parks model. And so what kind of trade-offs you have seen in doing something more park-oriented than Blackfoot?
Yeah, and we continue to look at those things, and as we look though historically at what was going on and what the status was in the area and how you could move forward in a more stakeholder-driven model, which TNC actually has in the project area. They have the Matador Ranch up there, and including something like the Blackfoot Challenge, which as we were starting was just kind of getting in their stride for conservation there, and have done a great job there. The model that, because of all the public lands and the price, the relatively low price, and the progress that had been made in terms of big conservation on the Great Plains, it was not moving ahead at the pace that it needed to be moved ahead, we thought, and the potential collaborators. That this was originally created under it was called the Northern Plains Conservation Network, was kind of a consortium of NGOs and even some government agencies that were involved. That one consensus that came out of that was that purchasing and conserving was a good model, because again, what the progress and actually the going backwards in terms of big just parks itself, top down model didn't make much sense to us either, because that wasn't happening, and it had happened in the past. And that sign I showed you, "Don't Buffalo Me." There's several of those in the neighborhood. When President Clinton proclaimed a monument, that created a lot of backlash. When the Fort Peck Dam was created in the 20s and 30s, that created a backlash because people were flooded out. So that memory is long, and so we thought a top-down model wouldn't work either. So it was kind of a mixture, and so far it seems to be working well, but now we feel we are behind the curve on the stakeholder side. That we need to do more work on the stakeholder side to pull in things like ideas like the Blackfoot Challenge and so forth. But we could have gone any of those other ways, and it might have worked also. But it seems we've made good progress. Our limiting factor right now is money. So I mentioned it was it's about $500,000. We've done $150 million. We would like to see this done in many of our lifetimes. It may not happen, but so we're going to really ramp that part up, and the team that we have has gotten pretty good at it. So that's exciting to think about. Yes, sir.
Yeah, do you see any progress on actually getting bison on the CMR itself? That's a big challenge.
So the state, I was just at a bison conference in April or May in the Flathead. The state has been, as you all probably know, working on environmental impact, programmatic state impact study for bison statewide. And they've got the draft out. The draft's been out for a while. They've made no decision. It's not obvious that they're going to make a decision. Martha Williams, who's the head of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, she spoke at this conference. It's been in progress about 6 years, and she said 6 years isn't a very long time for an EIS. So we're not holding our breath. So unfortunately, that means that in CMRs, the Fed's attitude has been, we will wait for the state to make a decision because it's a state managed species. And so they've been waiting for that decision. If it doesn't, it seems less and less likely that it's going to come. So then the Feds, the refuge manager, very proactive, is looking at some other ideas, some other models. There's nothing specific and clear because cattle have been taken, as we bought those ranches, cattle have been removed. politically very tough then to put that bison back on the landscape. So they're having to balance how that fits into the bigger picture. And as you might expect, they're not getting a lot of top-down support right now. So they're kind of keeping their heads down, maybe for the short term. But wild bison, as Sean Gary, some of you know, describes, it's like marijuana and lots of other things. It's inevitable. It's going to be it's going to happen. Bison will become, because the state of Montana, this last poll was done, over 70% of Montanans want bison classified as public and as wildlife, and so it's a matter of when. And that's our model too, is we want them classified not as livestock and private animals. It works now for us, okay, but in the long term we want public wildlife, and so it'll get there, and CMR will get there, but how and when is a harder question. But they're thinking about it and working on it and have some ideas, but in the short term it's pretty tricky for them. Yeah.
I had another question about the leases and the allotments. So is it the case that because bison are considered livestock, you can put those on the allotments and pay the animal AUM fees and
that's correct.
Treat them as if they're
so right now we're stuck in a slow pattern because we're in the middle of a federal EA, environmental assessment, by the Bureau of Land Management. We have asked for all of our allotments. So far we've done 4 allotments, converted that from livestock, one class of livestock, which is cattle, to another class of livestock, which is bison. You have to do the EA. We've done 4 of those. We've now just, because we had the 400,000, a 250,000 acres of allotted lands, we've asked for all of those to be converted. So that required what they call a super EA. I'm not sure quite the difference between EA and a super EA, except we hope it's super. They're in the process now. They've done the scoping. The scoping is done. They're writing the draft. And so we think within the next year and a half, we'll get that decision. Based on the science and based on history, it should go, but it's become more and more political up there. Some of the people against the concept have gotten a bit more organized and excited about it. And so we'll see, but that's where we're waiting. So we're kind of in a holding pattern right now on our lease lands until we get that approved.
But is the anticipation is that this would continue into the long term, that you continue just treating them as the animals that are on the allotment and paying the annual fees? And
midterm, I would say. So again, it depends on how they roll out, if and when they roll out some plan for the state of Montana or West-wide for management of public of those grazing lands. And I think there will be cases that come up where those will be challenged. But in the midterm, that's going to be the model where we lease those lands and we manage them in a different way than they're leased now, because we take down and that's why this is more controversial. We're not just replacing the species, we're also changing the management pattern. So in the midterm, I think that's going to have to be the model. In the long term, it's the state classifies bison as wildlife, and then they can move freely like mule deer or elk, maybe freely only in the sense of some confined area. They go behind that, then they're not quite so free. But some large landscape that you can have ecologically effective bison on them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any questions from those online? All right. Well, I think we better conclude.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Oh, the one thing I didn't say mention is come up and visit. So we're building a new campground, new huts. We've got a hut-to-hut system, yurts that we're building, and we got places for people to stay. So come on up.